We acknowledge the original owners of the land on which we podcast, whose stories were told for thousands of years. Today, we are recording in Meanjin. We pay our respects to elders past and present who may be listening. Sovereignty was never ceded. This episode of What in the NDIS Now is brought to you by Astalty. Astalty is the software solution for NDIS professionals built by NDIS professionals. Astalty is my go-to software, and Astalty is trusted and loved by hundreds of other NDIS providers. I love how easy it is to use and how it keeps all my participant information, notes, and invoicing all in one place, available to me anytime from any device. Sign up now for your 14-day free trial. Head to astalty.com.au to sign up now. See for yourself how much easier managing all your NDIS business needs are by using Astalty. Thanks again to Astalty for sponsoring today's episode. A quick note before we get started that there may be some swearing in today's podcast. If you don't like swearing or usually listen with children in the car, you have been warned. You're listening to What in the NDIS Now, a podcast where I, Hannah Redford, and my friend Sam Rosenbaum interview participants and providers about all things NDIS. Welcome, guys, gals, and non-binary pals, to another episode of the podcast. I'm really excited to introduce you to our guest today, which is Shaun. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi there.
Shaun, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm an autistic advocate. I am an NDIS recipient. Probably the advocacy that I'm most well known for is around subminimum wage. In 2018, I organized the first city-level ban of subminimum wage, as far as I know, in the world, in Seattle, Washington, and later Washington State as well.
Oh, amazing. That sounds so cool. So what do you mean by subminimum wages? Let's start there.
Well, in the U.S., as in the case in Australia, it's legal to pay disabled people below the minimum wage. So here, even though the minimum wage is about $23 per hour, depending on the industry, disabled people can be paid as little as $2.90 an hour.
Wow, that's quite a bit below the minimum. This is something that I am very aware of and frustrates me, and I was really excited to come across your campaign. People with disabilities who have jobs need to be paid the same as everyone else because they have the same costs as everyone else, for one thing, and because they're human, and you need to be paid for doing work. And it doesn't make any sense to me why people with disabilities are paid well below minimum wage.
Well, the policy comes from originally the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 in the United States, and the creation of sheltered workshops and a lower pay rate in the United States, as little as 1 cent an hour or less. And so that policy's been around for some 90 years, and it hasn't actually done what it was intended to do, to increase disabled participation in the workforce. And we have a very long view of history to know that. And what has been successful are things like supported employment and customized employment. Customized employment is where you build a job around a person. And when I say supported employment, I don't mean it in the euphemistic way that DES or Australian disability policy uses it, but actually supporting somebody at work with a support person, which we do here, but then we also just use it as an excuse to pay them less. So those things have been, more or less international best practice since the 1980s, regardless of what legal standards have been. And they're what have actually been successful in getting people employment, because the vast majority of disabled people in Australia and internationally don't work in shelter workshops and don't work for subminimum wage. They work in community-based employment, including people with the most severe disabilities, including people with intellectual disabilities, and so forth. But we still have this system that is just sucking up really large amounts of funding, headed by people who are getting paid hundreds of thousands a year and lobbying our MPs for very large amounts of money to keep staying in business, even though what they're doing doesn't work.
So can you tell us a little bit about your campaign in Australia and what you've been doing?
Yeah, so I started working around. I tried to see what was happening around disability employment policy, and there's certainly a lot of advocacy by organizations like Inclusion Australia around what would be ideal and how disabled people should be paid what we're worth and paid an equitable rate. It hasn't really been going anywhere. There hasn't been any momentum compared to what's been happening overseas. So, and I'm gonna have to draw a comparison here, but like in the United States, National Federation of the Blind started up a national boycott of Goodwill Industries, which is it's a nonprofit and mainly an op shop, and for a few years, no one took them seriously, and then they started getting lots of publicity and started making an impact. They got a national list of supporting disability organizations together, and it took them maybe 10 years, but they started getting a lot of momentum, and now you're at a point where 19 U.S. states plus D.C. have gotten rid of subminimum wage. But then I look here, and there really hasn't been the same kind of organizing. There's been, policy statements by Inclusion Australia, some labor groups, other organizations, but I haven't seen the same kind of organizing, of public alliances, and so forth. So I eventually just decided to start a letter and try to get organizations of any kind to sign on to it. And this was in April of 2022 when the federal election was starting. And I had a lot of difficulty doing it because the disability organization is much more hierarchical here. There's peak organizations of unelected people who, are in a position to be the leaders of disability everything and represent all disabled people, whether or not we want them in those positions. And so in most cases, there wasn't support there, or other organizations didn't want to do something if it wasn't coming from peak organizations. Exceptions being Women with Disabilities Australia and Inclusion Australia were very supportive of this. So I started getting individual signatures. I got almost 2,000 of those, and so I started being able to get organizations to sign on board. That got me more credibility, get more organizations to start getting MPs and councillors to sign on. This is similar to what I did when I was in Washington State, where I got 88 state organizations to sign on. And as I got more people who told me no before, I was able to peer pressure them into signing on, because I was like, oh, well, all 4 of your peer organizations have signed on. Do you really want to be the only one who hasn't signed on? So, I've been able to do a similar thing here. So like right now, I've got 35 national organizations, 168 local and state organizations, 16 senators and MPs, 41 state and territory MPs, and 115 councillors, and then about 2,100 individual people. Yeah.
That's amazing. That's staggering. in really a short amount of time. I mean, it must not feel that way to you, but realistically.
Well, because I've emailed all, 7,400 councillors in Australia, all 620 state and territory MPs. I'm working my way through the federal MPs. I've emailed all of the NDIS registered businesses, and there were over 10,000. So I'm like around 20,000 emails at this point, plus every other NDIS business that I come across, or a disability business that I come across.
Yeah.
I literally just ask everyone that I come across. I've got an underwear company on here. I have a concrete coatings company. I've got some artists. I just had a massage parlor sign on last week. Because every time Facebook suggests a business to me, I just email them, because this is just how I do things. And I got a lot more success in Queensland, whereas I think people from other states are just like, who is this person and why are they emailing us? But yeah. So I'm hoping that this will just kind of build pressure and at the very least create a list of who our allies are that disability activists and our allies can use to organize off. It's not really the end state, but it's at least something. It's at least what we had more before, and something we can try to use to push.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about the policies in Australia and what's sort of happening in Australia at the moment.
I'm going to ignore that question, and I want to.
Sure. Cool.
I want to talk more about the actual practices itself, because
Great.
I think that there might be people who have concerns, or I've gotten a few negative emails or nasty responses back, and so I want to point out a few ideas about the concepts around subminimum wage, and that's essentially that the whole concept is based around the idea of putting people in bad job matches and then not providing accommodations. The legal precedent for being able to pay a subminimum wage is the idea that someone's in a job that they cannot perform, and so you're paying them a fraction of the wage based on their productivity. And there's a few problems with that. One is that if I go to Coles or Woolies, and one cashier is half the speed of the other one, they're not going to be paid 50% of the cashier wage. And I've had people suggest to me, oh, well, then that person could lose their job. And I'm like, well, no one loses their job at Coles for being slow. I don't believe that. I have never seen that. So, there's an inequity there. But also, the way that these wages are determined is really manipulative. So who determines what a normal speed is for any type of piecemeal or production type of work? So let's say that your job is packing sprinkler heads into a box. They're going to determine what the normal non-disabled rate is. Well, if they've got a 50-year-old supervisor, a 22-year-old a 50-year-old manager, a 22-year-old supervisor, a 23-year-old supervisor who's been doing this for 2 years, another 21-year-old supervisor with experience in the job, they can get very different rates depending on which non-disabled normal person they use to determine what the normal non-disabled rate is. So they're not going to use that 60-year-old who's never packed sprinkler heads into a box, because they'd get a much slower rate. They're going to use younger people who have seen the job in practice, who know what they're doing, and they're going to get a much faster rate. So you can end up in situations where a disabled person could be performing the job faster than a non-disabled person is, or would be under the same circumstances, but they're getting paid less because they're doing less than that arbitrary magic line of what the normal rate is. But the non-disabled person always gets paid the prevailing wage, regardless of how fast or slow they are, or what their performance is. whether they're having a bad day or a good day, whether they were having a bad day or good day on the day that they were timed, whether or not that was being timed affected their performance, because you can imagine it's very stressful to have someone come in with a stopwatch, and your performance while they have that stopwatch is going to affect your pay for the rest of the year. All of those factors come into it. Not to mention, in assembly line types of jobs, much of the time, your ability to pack sprinkler heads, for example, is dependent on whether or not people bring you sprinkler heads. And if the other person hasn't brought them, the time doesn't stop for you. You're still being penalized if you only packed X many sprinkler heads in an hour, even if it wasn't your fault that they weren't brought over to you. So there's a lot of factors that come into how those numbers are determined. But anyway, so all of these ideas they come from a 1930s policy. I mean, we in Australia got it in the 1950s, but we imported it from an American 1930s policy that well predates any kind of disability or civil rights laws here internationally, the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, the Human Rights Act, anything like that. Generally under the law, if I go get a job, my employer is expected to make reasonable accommodations to me. Also, if I'm looking for a job, I would probably go and try to find a job that I'm suited for, and not one that I'm just placed into because I have a disability and I live in this geographic area, and every disabled person works at this factory in this town, or shreds paper in this town, or packs sprinkler heads in this town, or whatever you have. So,
also, some of those jobs can be really boring. Like, they expect people with disabilities to pack those sprinkler heads, and it's very repetitive, and you're looking at the same thing constantly, and you keep counting to 10 because that's how many fit in the box. And, you know, it's mind-numbing, repetitive stuff that can be boring no matter what your level of disability.
Right. And when non-disabled people do that kind of repetitive work in factories, they're not expected to do it for $3 an hour.
Yeah.
In fact, it being boring and repetitive are not used as reasons to penalize the person and pay them less. That's considered like a negative attribute of the job that should be compensated for somehow with breaks. So as a model, as a business practice, shelter workshops, ADEs, as they're more modernly euphemistically termed, don't work. They're about putting people into warehouses based on their location and their disability, into bad job matches, and expecting them to perform, and already expecting them not to be able to do the job, and then penalizing them for that expectation that you've set them up to fail. And when non-disabled people look for jobs, they look for something that's a good job match, right? You weren't assigned a job like, oh, okay, well, you're a brunette, you're going to work in this job. You know, you live in this town, you're going to work in this job. You presumably had the choice to at least consider, you know, do I want to go to university? Do I want to work a trade? What do I want to do with my life? And these are options that are often denied to disabled people. And that's how we end up in situations like this. So what has been effective, what we know works, are things like customized employment, where somebody has a job designed around them, or supported employment, where they go into a job and then they have someone to support them. And that's why a lot of people have fear-mongered here and in other countries that, oh, if you get rid of these, I've had people tell me when I've contacted them, if you get rid of these, you know, those people won't have anywhere to work, you know, the unemployment rate will go up, they'll be sitting at home. And I'm like, well, this has been happening since 1996, and nowhere nowhere has it happened. Vermont Vermont got rid of its shelter workshops in 1996, and employment rates have gone up since then for disabled people. So we have 28 years of data internationally showing that that getting rid of subminimum wage only improves outcomes for disabled people. And it's not like we have to rely only on international data for that either, because we can look around us and see that most companies are not using this model to employ disabled people. Most disabled people find work in community employment, including people with severe disabilities and intellectual disabilities. If this was an effective model, it would be everywhere, and the government wouldn't have to be propping it up with millions of dollars, most of which goes to salaries and overhead in order to keep paying people $3 an hour to do jobs that they're not suited for. There's a huge amount of money going into propping up this industry that doesn't serve disabled people, that has a much lower rate of keeping them employed, and it keeps people miserable. And you have family members who only support it because they're being told that the alternative is that they won't have anything to do and they'll be at home on the couch all day. And that's not true. We know that's not true.
Yeah, and so what I've seen is sometimes it's all the family knows. Like, the cousin had this job and their neighbour had this job, and they've never seen anyone with a disability have any other job. And so that's why they think that the ADE is the be-all and end-all and the only place to go.
Yeah, well, and there is an age difference there, because a lot of the workers who are in ADEs are older, and it's a lot harder to transition people out when that's what they've known. But ADEs, as a rule, are very, very large and wealthy companies, and they have a lot of money to lobby the government. Certainly as an industry, if you compare that to the kind of places that hire disabled people at full rates. And so there's a lot of money going into trying to keep these places open. And it's really frustrating when we have disabled people saying that we want to be paid equitably, disability organizations. We have a Royal Commission saying that this needs to go away, not that they ever listen to Royal Commissions. And at the same time, you have the current Labour government is opening pilot programs in Northern Territory and Northern Queensland to explore putting NDIS clients into ADEs as part of their NDIS plans. So this is a pilot program, but these are things that look at expanding it. I just got an email because I've been emailing all of these MPs, and I just got a letter from Minister Richworth's office on Monday, and I showed it to you on the way over here, and it was literally just, we recognize your concerns about subminimum wage, and we pumped even more money into subminimum wage. And it was just very tone deaf, and really shows their dedication to just expanding this industry and keeping it alive, and resisting any attempts at changing it and getting disabled people equitable pay, as is happening internationally.
As we're recording today, the government did come out with their initial response to the Disability Royal Commission. Mm-hmm. And like you said, they have decided that people with disabilities just need to go and get a job. And this blows my mind that they could look at all the stories that came out of the Disability Royal Commission and go, this is where we should start. Like, are you kidding me? But even if that's where we're going to start, the idea of pumping more money into the thing that is not working also just makes no sense. If you want to get people with disabilities into jobs, you need to say to employers, people with disabilities can do anything. And you just have to set it up so that they can do it. And yeah, like one of the issues I've found most in my working life is the issue of having to take my children to 1 million different appointments. And so having to often say, look, I can't work for these 2 hours because I've got to go to an appointment, or longer. I don't actually know how long it'll take because it's a hospital appointment and it sometimes takes 4 hours to get in, even if you have an appointment. So these accommodations often also can't be met because they're like, well, you've got to keep to your KPIs. And it's like, how do I do that when I've got all these appointments just to start with, before you even look at the accommodations someone needs within the job that they're doing?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's a lot of issues there. I mean, I'm reminded of, and I didn't go get the exact figures on this as I wasn't thinking about speaking about this, but Labor's own Job Summit found that DES had I think 1% success rate or 3% success rate.
Yeah.
And, it was on the verge of collapse, and now they've found a way to prop it up by putting new clients into the system. So this is another service that's only for disabled people, that does not serve us, that does not help us at all, that we're being forced into against our will because they make money off us. Disabled people are just a profit to people in government and people in the disability industry. And it's really frustrating. And I get that, like, when I interact with lots of service providers, some support workers even, sometimes explicitly so. So most of these systems that are set up, and they love to go on about the idea that the NDIS is so expensive and everything. And I'm like, well, we're not the ones who are profiting off it. You are. You've set it up this way so that you can profit off us. All of these employment systems don't work. They're designed to keep people unemployed because the caseworkers make more money the longer they have us in the system. So it's just everything about the employment system is really badly designed. Them wanting us to get jobs is just an excuse to try to be able to cut services or force us into more bad job matches. I mean, as you probably know, it's very difficult to get on the disability support pension since, I think, the Gillard government. So we have 40% of people in job seeker are disabled, which means they have to meet mutual obligations and attempt to find work, even though multiple studies have shown that everybody who can find work, pretty much everyone who can find work has already found work, and most of the people who are still on job seeker are there because they're disabled or because they have caregiving obligations or other factors like that. So you have people like, there was a famous case of there's a pilot in New South Wales with brain cancer who cannot get on the DSP because his condition isn't fully treated and stabilized. So he's only eligible for job seeker, but of course he can't find work, so he's had to sell all of his belongings and continue borrowing money. You have people who have lifelong permanent disabilities, but they won't qualify. It took me over 3 years to get DSP, and that was coming into it with 25 years of documentation of a permanent lifelong disability, just because they're so keen on everyone should work and no one has any barriers, and they want to penalize anyone who doesn't find a job. And it's really difficult. And I think a lot of people probably could find work or would be willing to work, But the issue is the barriers that exist in the workplace, and the government is doing nothing to try to address those barriers. Instead, they're increasing them. Cutting off people's payments doesn't help people find jobs. The low cost of the payments, which are well under half the poverty line, does not help people find jobs. You know, when I lived in the U.S., when I lived in Texas, which people love to look down on, when I went through employment services there, they bought me interview clothes. They got me a suit, they got me a shirt. The only thing they didn't get me was shoes because my feet were too big for what was in the shop. But then they felt bad and gave me extra clothes instead. It would have been very difficult for me to try to land an interview in a t-shirt and jeans or shorts. They don't do that here. Not that I've come across. They don't really have any interest in addressing the reasons why people are unemployed or helping address those barriers. They just want to punish people for not having them, which just drives people further into poverty, which just increases the disability unemployment rate.
And increases distrust of the government and government departments.
Absolutely. So they have plenty of models that they could do if they were actually interested in addressing any of these issues. If they were actually interested in disabled people should just have jobs, damn it, they could make that happen. At least they could get a lot of us jobs, but they don't want that. What they're looking for is a pretense to kick people off the job seeker. They want to find ways to phase people off disability support pension. They want to be able to cut NDIS plans, as they have been doing drastically for the last 2 years. Or they want to find reasons to say, hey, nobody else will take you for a job, so why don't you come to the shelter workshop for $3 an hour, run by our donors, and come work for them. So when I did this advocacy before, the U.S. system, I know that there's subminimum wage in Hong Kong and Israel as well, and I suspect the UK, but I'm not sure about that. But in the U.S., city minimum wage supersedes state, supersedes federal. And here it's all federal award wages. So I was able to organize locally and get a counselor to introduce a bill to ban the city minimum, the subminimum wage, and ended that. And then I worked on the state, and I used what I did in Seattle as a stepping stone. And then I got 88 organizations on board, and I worked from there. And I did some other kinds of sort of transitional work on the county level and back in Texas, where I started originally. Here, I've had to work on the federal level to address the core issue. It has to be a federal issue, but there's still state and local aspects of this, right? So there are 4 local councils, to my knowledge, in Australia that directly employ disabled people for below minimum wage. So the 4 are Ballina Shire, Gilgandra Shire, and Midwestern Council in New South Wales, and Manjimup in WA. So they are directly paying, that's the government directly exploiting disabled people and paying them a few dollars an hour. And then there's other councils that are preferencing ADEs in their business dealings. So I've learned from talking to counselors around the country that ADEs often benefit from subsidized rent or peppercorn leases, complimentary or discount room hire in council venues, council rate exemption or discounted rate, and favorable consideration in tender and procurement processes based on community goodwill. So there's a whole lot of benefits that they get interacting with individual shires. For example, Inner West Council in Sydney gives them a 15% weighting based on the idea that this is a social enterprise, the way that they would benefit an Aboriginal-owned business, which is wholly inappropriate because it's not a disabled-owned business. Disabled people are not benefiting from it. Some non-disabled person making hundreds of thousands of dollars is benefiting from the ADE. There is scope for local councils to address this, and I've asked, for example, the Brisbane City Councillors, and mostly without response, to try to address this. There are three international jurisdictions that I know of that have passed legislation banning themselves from paying subminimum wage and banning themselves and their departments from entering into contracts with any entities that pay a subminimum wage. Any ADEs would be the equivalent, and that would be the city of Reno, Nevada, the city and county of Honolulu, Hawaii, and the county of King, Washington, the last one being one that I organized. So there's no reason, sure, the federal government might continue to keep this in the books, but there's no reason that that councils should have to pay a subminimum wage, or that they have to do business with entities that do that, firstly. The other thing is looking at what the state and territory governments are doing. And in some cases, it might be the case that a state or territory government has enforced law that they need to preference these ADEs as social enterprises. I'm not sure if that's true. I haven't gotten a response yet. I know that's not the case in Queensland, so there's nothing stopping Queensland councils from deciding not to do it. But even if they do have a preference in case, councils could still decide to weight it with other factors to cancel out that weighting. But on the state level, all the same things apply. States supersede councils. They could just decide that no councils and themselves are going to pay subminimum wage, that they're not going to contract with entities that do this, et cetera, et cetera. So every level of government here could do something proactively about it. And I've had a lot of state MPs and councillors blow me off and say, this is out of scope and, they have nothing to do with it. Well, actually you do. You're just choosing not to, you've chosen not to support a value statement saying that you think that subminimum wage should be abolished, and you've chosen not to explore any sort of legislation that would improve things for disabled people in your area. So these are all things that people can demand of their MPs or councillors wherever they live. On the state level, this would be called procurement policy. So it would fall under a procurement portfolio.
Do you want to read out your statement so if people want to sign on, they know what they're signing on to?
Sure. We oppose the practice of paying disabled workers subminimum wage. It is unacceptable that in 2024, disabled people living in Australia can be paid as little as $2.90 per hour, while the minimum wage for others is $23.23 per hour. These practices don't help disabled people find work. We know from the Disability Royal Commission that Australia has one of the lowest disability employment rates in the OECD. As disabled people and allies, we support transition to fairer, equitable work through more modern and just practices to support disabled people in the workplace, such as supported employment and customized employment. We acknowledge the international workers' movement, led by disabled people, to end these archaic practices which originated in the 1930s and seek equitable pay. This movement has seen sweeping legislative success across the past decade. Disabled people demand equal pay for our work. It is time for Australia to abolish subminimum wages. So there's also a plain English version of the letter and a number of links to different sources on the figures given there.
Why have people opposed signing on to your letter before?
Well, like I mentioned, some of it is more legitimate fear around not knowing what the alternatives are, and thinking that paying a minimum wage means that these businesses will shut down. And if you do the math on it, paying somebody who works a few hours a week would isn't going to break the bank, especially with the salaries that they pay their executives. Some people think that the person will lose their pensions and their NDIS. NDIS is not means tested, and pensions are for a lot of people, they're not going to make enough money for it to make a difference. There are transitional rates, like it's not an all or nothing. But to be honest with you, the pensions suck. They're very low amounts of money. They come with a lot of rules and reporting. You can't even be in a relationship with in a pension, or they will dock your pension because they assume that your non-disabled partner should be supporting you, which actually forces and keeps a lot of people into domestic violence situations. The government can assume that your roommate is your sexual partner, even if they're not, because they've just decided that statistically you might be having sex with the person that you're living with, and dock your pension anyway. So if people can transition off their pensions because they can be paid a full wage for their work, that's actually a good thing. And it's only non-disabled people who've ever told me that would be a bad thing. If someone's been in a stable job for 20 years and they could be paid enough to get off the pension doing that, then they should absolutely be paid enough to be off the pension. But I've also heard some bizarre things. A lot of it is just based on the idea that, these are the only jobs for anyone. Like I said, most people, you will see more disabled people just in the community, in service jobs, in hospitality, behind screens, than you will see in ADEs. And I've had really bizarre ones. I did have someone tell me that I was going to take these jobs away from people, like child labor campaigners took cotton picking jobs away from children in India.
What? What? That doesn't even make sense.
He wasn't pro-child labor, though. Yeah. But
I'm not pro-child labor either. Although if my children could get a job.
Yes, but I was terrible because I'm taking jobs away, just like those terrible people who took jobs away from those kids in India. But anyway, yeah. So I've had lots of weird responses, and I have whenever I engage with these people about it, and then they realize that I know more about this topic than they do, they just stop responding and they never actually proactively engage with it or change their mind about anything. They just assume that they know more about this because obviously disabled people can't do anything, and then get annoyed at the idea that there's actually evidence that these are bad for disabled people, and all the data shows that getting rid of them, and not even just getting rid of them improves outcomes, let alone using that money that we're pumping into this system and putting it elsewhere would have better outcomes. I think that's something else that people don't understand. It's not even just that some of us are over here trying to either working in the community or trying to find community employment, and some people are happily working for $2.90 per hour. It's that the government is proactively putting tens of millions of dollars to keep a handful, just a few thousand people stuck in this industry where they only make $2.90 an hour, so that a few non-disabled people can get really, really rich off us. And the whole system with ADEs, they have a lot of funding streams that come in. So 1, they're tax exempt. 2, they're directly underpaying their workers. 3, they're utilizing their workers' NDIS funding. So if I go to a shelter workshop, and all ADEs only accept people who have NDIS. There's other places pay minimum wage that are not ADEs, but ADEs only accept people who have NDIS. My funding is paying a support worker who is supposed to support me so that I can do the job adequately. So even if this is a terrible job placement for me, they're getting an extra non-disabled employee who can do the job. They're getting 2 people who can do the job, and they're only paying a couple of dollars an hour. So they're getting all these different employment streams. On top of that, 4, they're benefiting from community goodwill because people assume, oh, if I buy goods or services from this company, I'm helping employ disabled people. Well, like, no, you're actually just making this one jerk really, really rich. So they have a lot of funding streams that they're using federally and locally, like I mentioned earlier, to make money. And in a lot of cases, they're doing so probably fraudulently. So I know a number of ADEs and other entities will use that NDIS funding and that or support workers to pay for general operating expenses or to pay for management, which is not what a person's NDIS funding is supposed to be used for. So it's a very big, when we talk about this industry, and it is an industry, it's huge amounts of money that are being siphoned from the NDIS, from the tax service, from federal revenue, from local ratepayers, mostly in order to pay the profit margins of these ADEs. And that money could be better used to support disabled people. A lot of cases, it's supposed to be being used explicitly to support disabled people. And it could be used so that person could have a job in the community and instead of somewhere isolated and get paid at least minimum wage, if not higher.
Yeah. One of the things I've found about people with disabilities is sometimes they start up micro businesses because you were talking about making a job around the person. Mm-hmm. So sometimes I've seen people with disabilities go, well, I'd really love to do, jumper making. And so they decide to just create a micro business around jumper making. I don't know why jumper making sprung to my head, but whatever. It's cold today in Brisbane.
I knew someone, a non-disabled person, who really had in her head, she worked in office, that she just wanted to make jumpers. I was like, maybe that's what she would do if she didn't have to work in an office. But anyway.
Yeah. Okay. But I found this a lot. So for example, a really good example was on a previous episode, we've spoken to an OT who started up her own business because she has a disability and she was previously working for a bigger organisation and she found that they just couldn't accommodate for her disability. And so she went out on her own to be an OT because then she can set her own hours and her own KPIs and work around her appointments and around when she's exhausted from her disability and things like that. And what I find is this happens a lot with people with disabilities because they're like, well, the only person I feel like I feel comfortable employing me is me because I know I'm flexible with that. And so there's a lot of people with disability who start micro businesses. Do you see that as an avenue the government could direct some of their money?
Yeah, I think that disabled people have to use a lot of different strategies to survive and adapt to society because it won't adapt to us. And especially because the government is so resistant to doing the bare minimum or even just not continuing to make it worse. So, we have people working in the open employment market. We have people who manage to get into really specialized kind of places. Whenever I go to Melbourne, I always, there's a coffee shop I like there, All Things Equal. They also sign the letter, but it employs all disabled people at higher, I think above minimum wage. And there's a waiting list now to work there. But there aren't a lot of opportunities for disabled people to work in the community in places that will accommodate us and not exploit us. There aren't a lot of coffee shops like that or places, so people end up doing things like you're talking about. They do an Etsy shop, even though I think Etsy is probably pretty exploitive with all of their artists, or they try to do a micro business. Again, thinking about customized employment, comparing it, and I've written about it before, but when I was in Seattle, there was a woman who worked for the city, and she had originally come on as a contractor, and she had made, basically she'd come on to get jobs for people with intellectual disabilities and high support needs. And when she'd come on, they were like, it's impossible. We don't have any jobs in the city that can be done by anybody like that. And she was like, okay, well, what about one job? And she ended up creating a job, because you might have an office environment where you have lawyers working and they're making however many dollars per hour. But some of what they do over the course of 8 hours is really is low paid work, like filing, clerical work that could be done by somebody else that doesn't have to be paid, hundreds of dollars per hour. And so she cut out parts of their day from several different people and created a job that had easier requirements and put in place for somebody with intellectual disability to be trained to do that job. And what I thought was really interesting was, at the time that I had gotten subminimum wage banned in Seattle in 2018, there were only 2 people in the city. City of Seattle, by the way, has about 800,000 people. 2 people legally being paid subminimum wage. I stress legally because there were at least 6 or 8 being paid illegally. But there were 113 people in this program working for just the city of Seattle, not the private sector, making at or above the minimum wage for the city, with intellectual disabilities and higher support needs. And so, that like this person, like what she did can be done anywhere. Like that's something that could be set up in a lot of different places. Microsoft had until like 3 or 4 weeks ago an autism employment program, including in Sydney. And so, as I understand, allowed people to bypass some of the interview processes that a lot of autistic people would not be good at, even if they'd be good at that particular job. Not something that I ever did, because, contrary to stereotypes, I am, not a programmer, not good with computers. And it's outside of my interest, but it benefited some people. So, there are a lot of things that can be done with customized employment. Could be set up and could be, and there are people with customized employment here, like it's an avenue, but it's not something that we've sunk tens of millions of dollars into because we're too busy making people rich. In terms of next steps, I've noticed I've had a lot of trouble getting a number of state and federal MPs to take me seriously, even when I email them, attach a letter. I've collated all the data so I can tell them you have 59 constituents in your electorate who've signed this letter, and you have these organizations in your constituency that have signed the letter. In addition to these 35 national orgs that cover your area as well, and they still tell me that I should be contacting my federal MP. So I'm considering if it would be beneficial to try and start an organization specifically around subminimum wage. And if I did that, I'd want it to have a range of disabled people involved geographically around the country, rural and regional, if possible, people who have connections to different parties, although I think a lot of us are very deliberately neutral or not particularly beholden to anyone. And so if there are disabled people who are interested in that or want to get involved in that advocacy, that might be something that we can to follow up on and we can look at. I'm also interested in more than just the the award rate exemption, but other ways that disabled people are paid subminimum wage. So when you look at programs like Work for the Dole, where people are coerced into performing free labor for the government in order to receive a pension. Well, we already know that 40% of people on job seeker are disabled and are just not able to get. They're not able to get the DSP because they had the misfortune to have brain cancer or a fluctuating disability instead of having an approved disability like spinal paralysis or something physical and tangible that the pencil pushers at Centrelink understand as a concrete disability. So they shouldn't be being forced to work for a subminimum wage or no wage, as the case may be, especially under the conditions that a lot of times they're working manual labor. There was an 18-year-old who died a few years ago on a job site because it wasn't safe and they weren't properly trained. And I don't remember his name, but I know he called his father beforehand that he didn't feel safe, and then he died. I was speaking to a counselor out in a more rural state, and she had been referred to Work for the Dole in her 60s, and they wanted her to drive like 2 hours to go do manual labor, and that's not. I don't think this person identifies as disabled, but it's really unreasonable to expect a 60-year-old woman to go do bricklaying and trench digging and such. Yeah, and so and a lot of the same companies that benefit from Work for the Dole also do subminimum wage. So places like the Salvos and Vinnie's do both of these things. And it really just having these programs in place where the government sends essentially slaves over to work for these private companies for free also means there's fewer jobs, because why would the Salvos hire anyone when the government is sending them slaves over to work for free? It just, in fact, the only ones they hire, I saw on I saw on a jobs website that they were hiring for a slave coordinator because they had so many of these different positions. So I guess they get a few of them, but it drives down the number of available jobs because they're getting so much free labor from the government, which is also a conflict because the government's providing free labor to these private corporations. Is it because they're lobbying? I don't know why these companies are getting these benefits. Another example would be prison labor. We know that prisoners in Australia are overwhelmingly likely to be disabled. We have statistics on mental illness. A lot of people kind of blow that off. But developmental disability is a lot more concrete and in a lot of cases genetically provable. So, a study was done testing every single youth prisoner in WA or youth offender in WA in a facility, and found that 89% of them had a neurodevelopmental disability. We are not 89% of the population, and 36% of them had FASD, specifically fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, which is a huge proportion. Australia has, I was just looking at statistics, we have one of the highest rates of maternal drinking in the world. Really high. There are no, we don't actually have numbers on how much of the population is born with FASD, but it's going to be a lot higher than most of the world, and we have a really high maternal drinking rate, and a lot of people don't know that one drink at a certain point of pregnancy can create FASD. So, but then you have neurodevelopmental disabilities like autism and Down syndrome and FASD. I don't see why prisons in WA are going to be any different from prisons in the rest of the country. There's no structural difference why those would be different. So we have a huge number of developmentally disabled people who end up in prisons instead of getting NDIS services, instead of getting support. And so, I don't want disabled people forced to work for free or forced to work for $3 an hour. And prisons are another avenue where mostly disabled people are made to work for a few dollars an hour. And it's not something that helps them learn skills. It's not something that helps them accommodate to their disability. It's not something that helps them when they're released. It's not something that reduces recidivism or does any of the things that we want as a society. So all of these things are tied into the exploitation of disabled people and our labor, and they're things that if the government was serious about getting disabled people jobs, that we would be looking at, and we're not.
Absolutely. So what is the best way for people out there listening to support your campaign?
Well, I have, they can sign it, especially if they have an organization that they can sign on and bring to the table. That'd be useful. I'm sure, I know there are people listening to this who haven't signed organizations on. They could, contact their MPs or councillors and put some pressure on. And you can also contact me, and I can give you a form letter, like some talking points if you want. And, there are some, if we can, trying to get rid of the sub-minimum wage Australia-wide is a really big task, and it'll be really difficult. But doing it incrementally in steps, that is something that's achievable. Overseas, it's been happening on a state-by-state and city-by-city basis. So when I look at this, I'm like, okay, well, if there's people in places like Ballinashire or Manjimup who want to see their cities, their councils stop exploiting disabled people, they're really in a position to do something about it, because if you can get your local community to do something, that's really easy. It's very difficult for me living in Brisbane, because Brisbane is the largest council in the Southern Hemisphere, to take note of me. But it's probably easier to start there than it is with the whole country. So putting pressure on people here, on our state MPs, to change the system, any of those things are possible. If there's disabled people who are really interested in this and really want to be involved, maybe contact me and we can figure out the logistics of putting together an organization so that we have more credibility and can figure out how to coordinate who our targets are and what areas we want to target and so forth. I think that when the election comes up, I'm also asking every candidate who's running for office again. So I'll be able to publish a list of who those candidates are who do and don't support that, and being able to distribute that information through disability networks to people who care about disability issues will be really helpful as well.
And your email address will be in the show notes, so people will be able to find all of the details in their show notes of this episode. So that brings me to, in your ideal world, what would the future of the NDIS look like?
The NDIS probably wouldn't exist, to be honest. The NDIS would just be healthcare and long-term services and supports, and probably just be a function of Medicare. And so instead of being this siloed system that's just for disabled people, so then politicians can trot out, oh, disabled people are so expensive, we'd be better off without them, and oh, the system is ballooning. Ways that they don't talk about aged care because they think that they're going to be old one day, and that they rarely talk about Medicare. It would just be part of Medicare, and if whatever you qualified for without these artificial barriers of are you disabled enough for the NDIS? And then, are you disabled enough for this service? No, we don't think you are. I mean, we did last year, but now we've decided that you're better. And, you've got to have a lifelong disability to get on this system, but now we expect you to get better. And if you don't get better, we're going to penalize you and cut your services. And if you do get better somehow, we're going to penalize you and cut your services. It was just all on Medicare, and you just get whatever you need, whatever is relevant to you. That removes a lot of stigma. They can stop paying tens of millions of dollars to lawyers. They can stop leaking our information to private law firms and then pretending to be Pikachu's shocked face whenever there's a breach because they have absolutely no technological security whatsoever. So yeah, I think it would just that we could just treat it as healthcare instead of treating disabled people like some separate species who need a completely different system subject to different rules.
Well, I love that answer. And that's exactly. So I think that's an awesome place to finish. I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And hopefully we can do it again and catch up about how it's going.
All right.
All right. Bye. Thank you for listening. Please share with people you know. Until next time, as the Green Brothers say, don't forget to be awesome.